Okay, here is the shot I'm working on today, but first let's do a recap of kinda sorta what's been covered in the last few days. We got this exchange between the king and Golek, where Golek's kinda kissing up to the king, Mr. Sweet. The soldier taps His Highness the Prince and the Honorable Tobias, and Vespigi says, "Ah, we were just talking about you, my son, Your Highness." And basically, Vespar comments on having just passed by Asher, who didn't even say hello, which is kind of weird. Golek tells him that that meddler is an enemy of the kingdom, which causes that reaction in Vespar. Okay, so now the question becomes what I want to deal with today basically has to do with why in the world would you, if you've got to animate this character and or say do a camera move, why in the world would you ever do it in Krita instead of doing it in Blender or say Tahoma? The idea is that in normal workflow, everything's a trade-off. Okay, so when you're working in Blender with the grease pencil, you've got the advantage of being able to work with what amounts to vectors, which means your characters are essentially infinitely scalable, and that presents a certain benefit. And for that benefit, there's a certain trade-off. So if you saw my recent video using Blender 2.9, we have the palette option now, which is kind of analogous to a Tahoma or OpenTunes raster level. It's a place where you can go to just paint. Going forward, I do think that Blender 2.9 and greater will continue to be an important part of my workflow. Um, there's a lot of really good reasons for that, but yet you might find it strange that I do find myself just like gravitating back to Krita over and over again. Funny enough, I actually thought this shot is a rehash of an earlier shot because there's no point completely redoing the shot twice if it's essentially a dialogue situation, where I would have sworn and truly thought that the original shot that this one was based on had been done in Blender. And then I looked close and realized no, actually I did the thing in Krita. So anyway, in this shot you get this reaction shot from Golek, responding to Vespar's blurting out laughter at the absurdity that Asher, who is a priest who feeds orphans, he's like about as harmless as it gets. The idea that he would be an enemy of the kingdom, of course, is utterly ridiculous to Vespar, and Vespar has known Asher since he was a kid, since he was young, because Vespar's still fairly young. He's like 16, 17 years old. Well, Golek just told Vespar that he's an enemy of the kingdom, so Golek, being a guy with a bit of an ego, doesn't really like being laughed at. So he has this response. Okay, let's watch that again. Okay, so now the question becomes, why in the world would you ever want to do this in Krita, since the animation tools in Krita do not allow for camera moves, do not really allow very easily for things like zooming in on a character, unless you do it all the hard way. You do it by hand. Okay, so, and the answer is that in the real world, what I find actually happens is you might, let's say we're going to cut and paste this Golek. You could take a hold of Golek, you could cut and paste him into Tahoma, and then use the plastic tool to get this animation going on, which I did with the Liquify tool. Okay, well, what happens is that those higher level tools definitely are very seductive. Okay, they will distract you maybe for weeks or months as you try to find all kinds of use cases, and indeed they have a lot of use cases. They're extremely cool tools. But in many, many, many cases, what you find is doing it the old-fashioned brute force way turns out to actually be just as fast, if not faster. So getting back to the question, why be in Krita at all? Well, when it comes to things like these highlights here, the shadows, being able to patch over the character and add details on another layer that covers up a mistake, which happens all the time. those things are a doddle in Krita. They're easy, right? The complaint I've had about Krita in the past, until recent versions, is that it's been pretty unstable. The sucker actually crashes kind of a lot. You definitely want to save your work frequently. Now with I think it's 4 that I'm using. Yeah, 4.4.1, which is a beta. Actually, I'm actually using the beta, and I kid you not, in the last month, it's maybe crashed twice. It really has not crashed. It's almost, it seems to be at Blender's level in terms of stability, which is great. So again, the question is, why in the world would you do it the way I'm doing it? Well, let's just take a look. You know, if I need to get Golek from this attitude to this attitude, I can hit the what's actually called the free transform tool. Okay, but if you right mouse click on that, you can use the Liquify tool. Well, what can you do with the Liquify tool? Well, if you kind of make the, you know, it's like sculpting in Blender. Okay, just watch the guy's head turn. Okay, you're actually getting a 3D head turn. You can make adjustments and then sort of compensate for them around like this, and you just sort of feel it out. It's a little bit inexact, but the fact of the matter is, you can review what you just did very, very quickly, and if it's not quite right, just add another keyframe and redo it, and then delete the one that was bad. So there's almost no cost to failure, if you will. Also with the Liquify tool, you can hit Control, and everything kind of sort of works in reverse. So now you can get these sorts of attitudes happening, which, and I think that's a good way to put it too. You're experimenting with different attitudes. So, you know, say we want them to kind of push back in incredulity, and then we sort of compensate for that this way, right? And then you need to toggle between your keyframes just to make sure you didn't get off character by stretching the guy out of shape, right? Okay. So in this case, actually, I would even argue that indeed a correction like that is called for. Okay. So what about this camera move? We do not have an animation tool per se in Krita, so you literally have to take Golek and scale him step by step. So just to be clear in terms of the workflow, what you would do is you basically want to work from the inner details outward. So the camera move generally would be the last thing you would do. What I actually did, let's turn this layer off and turn this layer on. And by the way, this again is kind of a compliment to Krita, because what you can do is get everything kind of working. Actually, okay, strike that. I forgot that I had already baked the movement into the character, so I added some other stuff on this one. But what I was going to say is, you can get it dialed into the point where it's kind of like, okay, it's safe now. Let's save our work. Okay, this is correct. I don't know what just happened there, but okay, so we don't have the zoom. So let's just watch that in motion. So this is all plastic, or not plastic tool. This is all Liquify tool. Literally all of it. I just took the Liquify tool and adjusted his mouth and his eyebrows. Okay, and so generally you would want to do that first. Get the emotion or the action baked into your character, and then your camera move would be the last step. So one way to do that would be to take this whole sequence, cut and paste it into Tahoma, and just use the Animate tool to make the guy bigger on the screen. Or of course you could actually use a 3D camera move. Well, what I chose to do, and I found this, what I'm about to show, to be very, very effective, which is I just created another level where I traced around Golek. So back here I traced around him, and then I said, look, I basically know what my timing is. Over the course of 4 or 5 frames, we want to get him to the point where he's this big on the screen, but we want to do it in a way that doesn't get real choppy and out of control, right? So all I did was just added another layer. Okay, I actually did 2 things. Number one, I took this layer, which had the facial animation baked in, and I said, let's just make a copy of it. Let's just make a safety copy and do the camera move in another layer. And then if everything works out well, we can just delete this layer, right? And if you look at our memory footprint, we're not even up to 200 megabytes here. For what it's worth, Krita 4.4 seems to be more memory efficient than some earlier versions, in the sense that I can load a full HD rendered image sequence, and I have done this a couple times just yesterday. Load an image sequence of a previous shot that was pretty close to done, pretty close to good, Um, and you know, it might get up to maybe 700 megabytes or something if you're loading, you know, 60 frames, but it's not punitive. It doesn't cause the computer to, you know, be ground to a halt in terms of performance. So anyway, what I'm saying is I just create another layer as a scratch pad, and I just map out the tween myself. I say, well, I want to get them from here to here, and I want 2 steps in between. Right? That's it. And then what I did was I said, well, I want to start here. And so again, I'm using the free transform tool, and I'm just going, okay, well, let's move it a little bit and then hit shift. Okay, and wrong layer. Sorry, common problem in Krita. Accidentally working on the wrong layer. Start scaling in, but then I hit control and shift and just make an adjustment like that. And I say, well, I'm going to need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 frames to do this. So I got to get them from here to here over 5 frames. So I take this and I just go ahead and scale this. So I'm going to come up to that blue line there. I'm going to come up to this blue line here, and I'm going to come up to this red line like that. Okay? So now, without a doubt, that's a little more cumbersome than using than allowing in, you know, as we can do in other programs, allowing the animation tools to do the interpolation for us. Without a doubt, that is simpler. The question for me is, in practice, given the shot that I'm working on, is it actually faster, or is it actually more accurate? Because if you don't have, for example, your interpolation set up correctly on your Animate tool, whatever program you're using, you might find out that once you actually look at the amount of fiddling you have to do to take the interpolated rapid version and actually make it perfect, in many cases, this is just my experiences, in many cases it winds up not being much of a time savings at all. In principle it is, in practice it's really not, because you have to go in and begin massaging the data around those actual keyframes and whatnot, you know. So in this case, it took all of 30 seconds to do this camera move, and then I just moved the background a little bit less. Okay, I moved the background slightly, in other words, zoomed it slightly less than I zoomed the foreground character, so that it had the appearance of a parallax situation. But the point for me is, this looks pretty good. You know, this is a good looking shot. And you could also argue that there's some loss of fidelity. This is completely true. There's some loss of fidelity when you use deformation tools on your characters. So however sharp he is here, you will absolutely notice that as you go along, he gets a little bit blurred. Okay? So you might go, that sucks. You know, we want it to be sharp, so we really want to be using Toon Boom or some other vector-based tool like Flash so that we don't lose that fidelity or we don't get that blurriness. Well, wait a second. Wait a second. The question isn't whether that distortion happens. The question is whether it matters. I want to show you a little secret here. If you look at this entire timeline, what you might not realize is this right here. I actually have a quick blur on the entire show. Well, why would you do that? Well, the reason I would do that is because every single cartoon I have looked at in full HD, I shouldn't say every single, there are actually exceptions, but the vast majority of cases, when you actually look at the final delivered broadcast program, you discover that a little bit of blurriness is actually a good thing. And the fact of the matter is that the amount of blurriness that's introduced here is below the threshold of blurriness that we're actually going to ultimately want on the show. Now, of course, it's also worth mentioning. Think of it this way. When he's in motion, when your character's in motion, you can get rid of murder. You can get away with murder. Okay. So in other words, no one's going to notice the blur while everything's moving. So what actually matters here? What actually matters is this final frame. It's when you rest and give the audience the ability to digest what's going on visually. Okay? Well, okay. Add yourself an unsharp mask just on that one frame, if that's what you want to do. Okay, we can preview that. You can see it just gives it a little bit of crispness, and that's pretty gentle. You could obviously go much higher if you wanted to, where the unsharp masking becomes very obvious and evident to the point where it's actually a little bit egregious. In other words, it's easy to make unsharp masking look worse than the blurring you were trying to fix. Put it that way. But it's not a horrible idea to say, okay, let's look at what's the actual size here. Okay, so that's your actual size on screen. You can tab it. Okay. So now, in literally a matter of seconds, admittedly, it's a little sharper here. But, you know, you just compensate for it. And at the end of the day, the question is, could you get your shot done? And, you know, how much time did it really take? So this shot, to get this reaction from Golek, actually took about, I mean, the whole shot took 10 minutes because I'm reusing assets from another shot. And by the way, just for the record, if you're out there thinking, well, maybe that unsharp masking should be done here as well, I would agree. So I'll just go ahead and add that. I hit Control F. That repeats the last filter you used. So there we go. Right? And we've got our shot done. So we can now move on to the next shot and rock and roll. So I'm just kind of letting you into my noggin, you know, inside my brain, to say these are thoughts that go through my mind because your animation is hard. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of experimentation. It's easy to create little toy animations that, you know, prove out features of different software just to kind of see if you're able to do what you maybe thought in your mind you might be able to do. That's perfectly natural. I do it all the time. I've wasted more time than I care to admit doing what amounts to tests and experiments, because invariably what happens is that the feature that's going to save you all this time always comes at a cost. And sometimes that cost is pretty small and turns out not to be a big deal. Sometimes it turns out to be actually a deal breaker. And I will tell you the truth, I don't want to demonstrate it here today on YouTube. I may get to it. But I did a video just a few days ago on animating in Blender 2.9. Again, I do think Blender 2.9 is going to continue to be part of my toolkit. However, without getting into the details here, I will also say this. The deeper I dive with the palette option in Blender 2.9 and the actual steps you have to take in real time to use it, to sample colors, like for example here in Krita, if I need to make a fix, let's say, all right, let's just say I'll create a hypothetical here, okay. Let's just say I don't like his eye here. I want it to be a little bit, I want to cut that in a little bit, but let's say for whatever stupid reason I don't want to actually mess with my main layer that my character's on. And by the way, in many cases, this layer that is just one layer would often be comprised of 4 or 5 layers. You know, a layer for shadows, a layer for color, maybe a layer for your outlines, blah, 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 blah. Well, here we can go click, grab a brush, sample whatever color's under the brush, and just paint and fix it. Boom, fixed. Boom, fixed. Literally, it's done. Okay. What I found was the deeper I'm diving with Blender 2.9, the promise of the palettes and the reality in terms of the steps and the clicks and go back here and change that and adjust this, it turns out that the cost of using the palettes in Blender is actually extremely high. It's not kind of high. It's actually extremely high. And the last shot that I did, which would be This one here, I believe. This was done in Blender 2.9. Okay, so visually it looks like it could have been done in Krita or any other program where you're just basically scribbling. I mean, the visuals of it aren't bad at all. But I use the palettes, and just again, because I don't want to open up Blender 2.9 and get into a big explanation, I will just say this. You would be amazed how brutally difficult it was once I got downstream on this shot to be able to go back and simply sample this color right here and make a correction. It was, the process became very laborious. And that's the interesting thing about animation software. Having to do a camera move, especially a parallax camera move like this, when you first glance at it, if you were gonna do it mechanically frame by frame, it looks on the surface like this would be the laborious process. This would be the difficult way. And what you find is in practice it's not always, but it often turns out to be just the opposite. It's actually the hard way turns out to be the easy way, and the easy way turns out to be the hard way. And I've been amazed how often that has proven to be the case. And so hence I tend to keep I tend to keep going down these roads with all kinds of software, well, okay, OpenTunes, Tahoma, Blender, 12 different versions of Blender, and I always seem to wind up coming back to Krita because I just want to get my work done. Right? That's the truth. I just want to get the work done and not get bogged down in fighting with the software. So, and I've just increasingly found I fight the least with Krita, and only because now it doesn't crash very much. So anyway, that's the story on that shot. The next shot is going to be fun and interesting. Since I've used 20 minutes here, what I'm going to do is leave it at that and kill this video. But the next shot should be fun because what we're going to do is we're going to be taking this character, Tobias, and I'll completely redraw him because I think I'm just going to do the shot in Krita and have him do some dialogue, but there's going to be a little bit of acting involved, so it should be fun. So for now, we'll leave it at that. And as you guys know, there will be more later.